I had a PR that is still out to improve multi-cluster telemetry, with the idea being, I think this came up in a previous discussion, we didn't have cluster IDs captured in any of the telemetry. And so there's a PR out that has the potential to add cluster labels, source and destination, to the default telemetry. And I think the question is, do you want to do that, or do you want to make it configurable? So I'm sort of interested in everyone's thoughts on that. And I will find...
I'd like to see it in the default. It doesn't sound like it would be a problem with cardinality off the top of my head.
Okay. And Niraj, you had asked, you had a different take on that?
Well, I should say I have questions. So what's the impact of making it default? A low cardinality label will always be added, right?
Yep.
Which will be more or less useless unless we show cluster in Kiali and other dashboards by default. Right. Do we currently show clusters in Kiali, Jay?
We would like to. I mean, a couple of versions back, we took a look at what we could do with multi-cluster traffic, and the answer was that if it was a shared control plane, basically a different instance per cluster, we could do something. And we put a little bit of code in to help people track requests going between the different clusters. But I think we talked about it on the last call. It's sort of like you can see something leave, you can see something come in, but you couldn't connect the dots. So we don't do a lot of multi-cluster representation in the topology yet, but that we could potentially add it here. I agree that it would be useless if it's all within the same cluster. I mean, there's really no need to supply the labels, for one thing. So you could potentially just supply them when those two IDs were different. I mean, more and more people seem to be wanting more multi-cluster from what I see. More people are doing it. But the shared control plane use case is very difficult right now, for us at least. So that's an issue in itself.
I see. I agree with you. People do want to do or try multi-cluster, and basically telemetry is the best hope to understand what's happening there. So the downsides are you see one label that is being added by default, which will mostly not change if you're just doing single cluster. Doug, can we maybe in the docs, if somebody is managing their own Prometheus, we can say, hey, this is how you drop this label if you want to preserve old behavior? That will solve it.
We can absolutely explain how to drop it. Yeah, it'll just be noise for single cluster situations. It'll say Kubernetes for both labels, source and destination.
There are two labels. Interesting. Yeah. I forgot about that.
So yeah, we can absolutely explain how to drop it. I mean, the other thing we could do is take the other posture, which is if you want it for multi-cluster, here's how to do the special customization of the metrics with this information. But then again, I think that impairs Kiali's ability to handle that, right? A little bit.
Well, I mean, I mean, if it's not there, obviously we can't do anything about it. I mean, I'd hate to see a lot of waste from the perspective of just storage of, one thing that was done with the gRPC status, right, is that when it wasn't relevant, it wasn't supplied at all, which is not usual not usually what was done in the past. I think it's the only instance of a label like that that I know of. I don't know if this would be something in that could be done in the same way. I'm not even, because you can't do it unless you know whether it's going to be relevant or not.
So here is another, basically on these lines, what we can do is in the multi-cluster documentation section, explain how you can turn this label on and get more telemetry. And also keep it under the telemetry section of the Istio docs. And for this release, go with the safer posture of not turning it on by default, adding the docs in the next release. We can make it on by default if we find that most of the people actually use it.
Yeah, I think I'd be fine with that. That seems like a safe approach. If that's what everyone else.
Is that so? How would this ID? How do you identify what the cluster is? Like, so could this ID be used? Is it just for display, or is it going to be a way for us to actually potentially contact the other cluster? So, like, say we wanted to get service information from cluster B. So, say you had something going from cluster A to cluster B, right? And I think one of our issues with handling the shared control plane was we had this issue of, well, where do we get the service definition, for example, or where do we go to get the workload if we want to show the details of that particular thing. By having cluster IDs that could actually help us look in a certain place for a definition could be, useful. But if it's just some label that's not going to be able to be used as some sort of identifying ID that we could use in querying or access or API, it would be less useful.
The ID is from the cluster ID, which is set in the install. It's an install time setting for cluster ID.
Okay, that's cool.
I don't recall if there's any guidance on how to make those IDs, but I do know that it's just taken directly from whatever was supplied at install time for the cluster.
I think that's totally correct. Jay, your use case is interesting with shared control plane. I don't know if it will just straight away work for shared control plane, to be honest. Because like the resources that live in different clusters, I don't think you'll be able to query it based on this identifier.
Yeah, that's my feeling is that's probably true. I still think it's useful. It could, it would be certainly more useful. I don't know that it will help us in being able to contact another cluster from a shared location, but that could always be something to look more at in the future.
Exactly. So it looks like currently in the installation options, there is global.multicluster.cluster name.
Yep.
Which once you have multi-cluster enabled, you can set to what that cluster name is. And then that will be passed through proxy metadata to each sidecars.
Yep. And that's used for the cluster ID. Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like this suggestion is okay with everyone and is the way forward. So I will update the PR to match that, and then we can review that. Sound good?
Yes, because I think users would like any assistance they can get with regards to tracking the multi-cluster requests.
Okay. The second topic is basically the same thing, just with a different label. There's been a work on the request classification piece, and so the question was, do we want to go ahead and make request operation a default label that's exposed, or do we want to make it configurable? What do we want to do there? I think there were some big concerns about adding this, especially for traffic that comes through the gateways. So I just wanted to float this to the group.
My stance will be the same here, Doug. I think we already have insane amount of labels.
Yeah.
We need to go to a place where the set of default labels are more or less fixed, and then we make it easy for customers to customize dimensionality based on their use case.
Yeah, that's the way I feel too. I think Mandar was pushing to make it default, and he's not here now to represent that viewpoint, unfortunately. But okay, I'll just report that as famous.
Yeah, these all should be sections in the telemetry docs, which says this is how you can configure operations. And I think Jay was requesting this. I don't know who requested this feature.
I don't think it was me.
This came up from a number of different places. I think it sort of had been just asked by various users and discussed in Slack for a long time, and a couple of customers were also asking for it. So I think that's where this all bubbled up from.
That makes sense. So Doug, quick question here. I know the UX for enabling or adding and customizing labels is still not that awesome. Is that still the case? And that's why you and Mandar are both hesitant?
I can't speak for why Mandar would be hesitant. Yeah, I was trying to avoid any unnecessary configuration because it just doesn't seem like it's totally ironed out, especially with the other proposals around hiding the config and things like that. But maybe, I mean, Kawat-san, maybe he can speak. Like, I don't know how we're feeling about that configuration today and whether or not we think that that's in a good enough state that it's not a big deal for users.
It's not very usable, but we're trying to update the docs. There should be a post on the website, just converting the wiki into docs and making it a bit more detailed.
Well, you say it's not really used.
It's hard to use, but it works. That's the problem. There's a lot of things you don't understand when you use it, which just makes it difficult because you have to edit certain things in certain ways.
So Quat, your change for adding this in mesh config, is that still on hold?
No one approves it. I don't know how to get it in.
Oh, you're saying no one approves it? Oh my goodness. My PR is stuck also, but I don't know what to do also. If you also don't know, I don't know what to say.
Is the experience easier if we already have the labels in Bootstrap? Does it become significantly easier?
Yes.
Yeah, so, we could pre-populate some labels that would at least make it easier to avoid the second step.
Yeah, so that would be my preference, is to go ahead and do that for operations so that it's just like a single thing you have to do to get it working.
That's right. So I think there are 3 steps right now. One is Bootstrap. Second is pod annotations. And third is configuring the envoy filter. I think we can get rid of the first step. We can also get rid of the second step if Quad's PR goes in. I think then it will just be down to the third step.
Okay. Quad, can you link the PR in the notes here, and then we can all go and...
The doc PR is not posted yet, but I've been working on a Google Doc with Adam.
I can add your API PR. By the way, I poked Lynn and Louis and Sriram for your PR, Quad. No one replies.
That's not encouraging. Yeah, I guess we can just keep poking and see where we get. Okay. I don't see Peter yet, so I don't know that we'll get to that last one. So the only other thing that I had on the agenda was starting to do some planning for 1.7, and I don't So I don't know if anyone's given any thought to that, but I think we have 1 or 2 weeks at most until we're supposed to have our plan done for 1.7. So I was going to open up the floor for ideas.
But just prior to that, though, I would
sure.
say that that issue where we have for Peter, I mean, it is Peter's issue, but if you look at the comments, the most recent comments, it's him asking mostly you guys for advice. So I think he's actually in a wait state because he's saying, Mandar, Kwat, Niraj, help. So if you guys could take a look at it, even if it's post-meeting, that's fine. It doesn't have to be now.
Well, I agree with his comment. I think it's not reliable to use host header, but it's
Yeah.
so it's actual host header.
That's why, Jay, I had asked this question, and I think Kwat and I have been saying this for a while, that this is not that easy to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that might be the case. So it's the question is what's actually doable, or is anything actually doable now that we look under the covers? So I don't mind if this. I would just like to see this discussion continue. It doesn't have to continue in this meeting, but I mean, if we can't really do anything here, then maybe let's figure that out. Or if there's something we can do, let's figure that out.
So I think, Jay, the requirement, so I think here you are the product owner in a way for this feature. You need to give requirements, and then Peter can come back with design. So are your requirements that whatever client requested, irrespective of whether there is an actual service for it, or do you want actually a service behind this label?
I guess I think maybe my initial understanding a while back was perhaps incomplete, because I was thinking, all right, service A makes a request for service B, but given the fact that there's virtual services in play, it doesn't actually go to service B. It goes to service C, right? It gets rerouted. Or maybe it goes to service B and C because of mirroring or something like that, right? So I always had this idea that a request comes in, and then what we end up with in today's telemetry are the destination service name, namespace, right? Those are the resulting fields for where this thing gets routed. That's what happened. And I always thought that, well, but what happened to that? The original request was for something potentially different. So how do we, if you're talking about a visualization, if you're talking about like a Chiali graph or something, you're thinking, well, maybe there should be an arrow into like a virtual services, and then out of the virtual service, you see where it actually happened. That was kind of what this was all about. But now that Peter went to look into it, we really have like this incoming header, right? But at some point, that requested host gets processed and turns into the actual destinations. I just don't know whether or not it's feasible or not feasible to understand or to get any sort of information that will help us understand what was actually requested past, compared with what actually resulted, basically. And I actually thought it wasn't that big a deal, but I think he's starting to read this now that he looks at it. It seems like maybe it's a bigger deal.
Doug, do you remember if we managed to add annotations for the virtual service into the metadata at some point?
The metadata for virtual service and destination rules should be available in the config. Unless someone has stripped that out. It was there last I looked.
Yeah, I think
We
so
could
too.
leverage that, right? At least to get the data.
So, there are two sides of this, right? So one is if you want to map, or if you want a label for client's intent, that is, I think, only represented in host header right now,
Yeah, I would agree. That feels like that's captured.
right? And that's already there.
Because
Then
it's
there is,
the host header value is what you're then comparing to the virtual service host definitions, right? To figure out what's applying.
yeah. So let me come to the second piece. Then the second piece is the the mesh operator intent, which is virtual service and maybe a bunch of other things that might happen, right? Based on the routing. So you want the second piece, right? You want how routing happened. Is that correct?
I would like to be, I mean, I feel like a person, a developer, a mesh developer that's defining virtual services. I feel like it's an incomplete view, observability wise, to just tell them what the destination was. Here's your source, here's your destination, when in between there's all this potential logic going on that determines that destination, right? I mean, what we do today in Kiali is we try to indicate where virtual services may have played a part, but it's all sort of inferred. And so what I was looking for was something more explicit, a way for us to show the user, okay, you did define virtual services, and it looks like it came into play here, potentially. That's the intent. But I understand that, in reality, it's maybe not that easy to figure it out. I wouldn't say I want to see like virtual service names, in the telemetry. And you could have multiple virtual services involved even in one request. So you don't want that. But, maybe even the original requested host is a good thing, this host header, but then, you have the issues that he's bringing up right here. So I think you can see what I'm talking about. I just don't know whether there's much that we can do about it or not.
Could we put the virtual service into tracing span labels, maybe?
Tracing is another way to go.
Because we don't even monitor mirroring, for example, on the client side. At least we can get some data for that part.
Yeah, mirroring has been a long-standing gap in the telemetry.
Yeah, and Rob's point is also interesting. Like if we do end up adding like a virtual service name, it's going to be lost when the virtual service changes over time.
Yeah, we don't want config in telemetry. Because telemetry should remain like what happened.
Yeah. What happened is a snapshot of config. That's the problem.
It is, but you don't want to actually be referencing definitions, getting into that whole deal.
Yeah, I think it's more like an audit service where you might need separate stream of data saying.
I agree with that too.
Like tracing the control plane basically here.
Do we want this as an always on or as a debug tool, right? Because as a debug tool, you could turn it on and have the virtual service name appear in metrics real quick, and then turn it right back off once you validated your rules are right? So then you know what the snapshot is, and it's a controlled time frame.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think most of the time people are interested in looking at pretty much a very recent view of what's been going on. And so that in general, the definitions that are currently there are fairly relevant to the traffic that they're looking at. I agree that sometimes they'll look in the past. They may want to go back and do comparisons with the past or whatever, but a lot of the time it seems to be more recent. And so far, we haven't gotten a lot of complaints about, these issues about the config not matching what they're looking at. But and that's why I was kind of trying to steer this particular issue as literally just trying to figure out if there's any clues that we could give to the consumer of telemetry that what they requested was maybe not what they ended up with because of virtual services, because it does happen.
Could we have different metrics that are just focused on virtual service? Is there a path there, or you're just trying to trace things through config, separate than the other metrics, and not try and collapse them? Is there something we could do along those lines?
I think we discussed all these solutions quite a while back, and all of them have some or the other problem. If you emit another metric, then somebody has to correlate those two metrics together, right? Kiali can do that, but it's the same issue. So
could also paint maybe, like at least whatever request was processed via virtual service or just passed through.
That's where I was going, Quad. So I think the authoritative source here is basically all the matching that happened, because we already have the first what client's intent was, and we have the destination. What is missing is just the things in the middle, and the things in the middle are either based on matchers or based on some actions like mirroring, right? So we shouldn't try to actually store the name of virtual service, but we should try to store the names of those matchers or actions. That can work. It can be a list, for example, like what is saying, if multiple things were happening.
Are all those things named?
All those things, you're trying to understand how you will get them in the extensions filter?
Well, I was just wondering if those are always named, or if you're going to end up
so I'm talking
names.
So how it gets lowered, right? So look at the route configuration for Envoy. What will happen is you will have a list of routes with a list of hosts in them. So one of them will match, or series of them will match. And I don't think we should try to pick out a metadata there. We should try to pick out what exactly matched, I'm saying, and then store that. That will be always consistent, irrespective of revisions of the configuration.
Is that important though? I mean, I'm just from like a user perspective, what would be important to me is to see what was the service routing, right? Where did I go? Where did I want to go? And where was I sent? And, how things actually mapped or matched out is sort of more like a debugging exercise. I would also be concerned that if you took that approach, that could be, expensive in terms of generating the telemetry details, right? So if, like I said, so the first is if I'm looking at this from a user, here's how the service routing occurred. And then after that, I guess the next problem is why did that happen? But I think that just comes into play if stuff isn't working right. So, I think it's, I think we should get away from having like configuration details tied in with the telemetry, right? The telemetry's there, you can visualize it. If the telemetry's not there, you can't do anything. So I think the question to what you were talking about, Niraj, is it important to have those details in the telemetry so that we can look at it historically? Or is it enough to just say this was, version X of, or revision X of the, pilot config for that? But I mean, that's even kind of useless too, because if the configuration has changed, it's really just, I don't know. Sorry, I'm starting to ramble, so I'll stop.
No, I think your point is valid. And that was also Doug's point, right? Whether this is a debugging tool, in which case you turn it on when there's a problem, or do you always want to see it? If you always want to see it, it has to be derived from some combination of telemetry and config, right?
Let me ask this question. So what would be the match when there's no virtual services involved at all? So
There's a default, and that default is based on your mesh global settings, whether you allow all traffic or you block all traffic.
Maybe I don't understand the problem, but why isn't it just enough to have the requested service in the telemetry details and just that gets visualized if you want it?
It's already there, the requested service, as part of the host header.
Then what? So I'm sorry, because I'm like new to this, so I'll just ask the dumb question. What is the problem like we're trying to solve?
So the way I've been internalizing this is that we want to be, there's a desire to understand how changes to config impact telemetry, and to do that in a direct way, or to make it observable when your changes to config and which pieces of config are contributing. And so, I mean, others may have a different understanding of this problem, but so to me, it's about how do I link things that have gone on in the config world to things that are happening in the data plane world. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. And, you know, I think that's what the original request here was, that you take that host header and you break it down to that requested service and you put that in the default telemetry. And then you let something like Kiali try to figure out whether there was a virtual service there involved, for example, by potentially doing its own work against the current definitions on the virtual services and the current, to a degree, some of the same matching that goes on.
So I don't think we need to look up every single virtual service attached request, right? Because most of them don't really actually do much. Like if it's just a default routing pattern, then why do you need to know what service config was supposed to be there? So maybe we need to look at the kinds of things that we are looking for, like what Niraj was saying, whether the host was changed or whether request was mirrored, and then just collect that data and propagate it using tracing means.
I mean, even having the requested host and maybe even some flags, like, you know, mirrored, rerouted, or something, you know, whether there was a VS in play that changed routing or anything like that.
Yeah, so request handling flag or something is an interesting middle ground there.
I mean, we definitely want something lightweight. We definitely don't want to try to tie it directly to config, but I think the user may want to know that there was config involved in the routing.
So, sorry, somebody else was saying something. I'm going to shut up. All right. So, so Jay, I mean, I totally get where you're coming from. There are two personas here. One persona is as a service owner. I absolutely don't care, because somebody else is responsible for routing, or if I'm responsible for routing, I just want to know it worked. So when it doesn't work, I need this information. Then there is a person whose job might be to just understand how everything works in their cluster with Istio. Maybe they are the only person who needs to see this information all the time. I think in the beginning days of Istio, when most of the time the clusters were broken because nobody understood Istio, this feature would have been extremely useful. I don't know if we still need to even expose this to everyone, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I feel like there are times when we're missing the requested host, and it could still be useful. And I still feel like there's times when it would be nice to know that there were virtual services involved with the request.
We can make a
maybe-
debugging tool for that. That's for sure.
Well, maybe we can follow up and capture some of these thoughts in the issue again now, for Peter's benefit, and while it's fresh in our minds. And I also don't want to use up the whole meeting because I know Doug wanted to look at 1.7. So I guess that's where I'm at.
Okay. I tried to capture some of the questions real quick in the notes, but please add more intelligent and more thought out notes there, and then we'll I think continuing the conversation on the bug makes a lot of sense. Does anyone else want to say anything else here before we move over?
Thanks for the discussion.
Okay. So I haven't even started recording any ideas here, but I just wanted to open the floor and see what we could come up with. I think my contribution is this. I feel like we need to focus on getting the extensions API sorted, and improving the experience around the various bits of telemetry flags we've exposed in various places, including mesh config and annotations. So I feel like that's a top priority for this next release. But I don't know what others think there. So that was my first instinct, and then let's see. I think metrics expiry. Just transfer some stuff over. Metrics expiry, I don't think happened, so I think that's still on the list. I think there was some dashboard work that always needs to happen, and yeah. So I'd love to hear from other people. What else do you think should be a target for 1.7? What are the big ideas and big gaps that we see?
I think telemetry V2, we need to close all the gaps now. Like we don't have good solutions when the client is not in the mesh, for example. And I think we deprioritize them. This time I would keep them as P0s. I mean, these are the things that will prevent users from adopting telemetry V2.
And telemetry V1, as I understand it, is supposed to be removed completely in 1.7. Is that true, or is that still on the table based on how well people can use V2?
Is 1.7 it's the last release where we support V1? Is it?
Oh, okay.
Are we removing it? I thought it was. I've lost track of the timeline too, but I thought it was the last official release where that's supported.
Okay. I thought it was the other way around.
Oh, maybe I'm
You're probably right. I don't know. I thought I heard Mandar say at some point that it was gone in 1.7, but maybe he said maybe it was the last release that it was in.
I mean, it's never going to be really gone. I think it's just going to be moved away into sort of stale project.
Mhm.
But that's action item that might need to be on 1.7. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think on telemetry V2, we have to make sure we are not using envoy filter. I think we have to keep that as a priority.
Yeah, and I think that's a P0, right? I mean, that's something.
So Doug, I know you're adding the cluster ID for multi-cluster, which is a great start for multi-cluster telemetry support. Have you actually tried, like what, is there anything else missing for multi-cluster telemetry, or is that this is good enough?
I have done very little with multi-cluster and testing and everything else. I ran through a test where I was able to get metrics from multiple clusters pulled into the same place. But I didn't do anything beyond that in terms of usability studies. And I just remember being told that the missing cluster ID was going to be the biggest thing. And so that's why I focus on that first. But there could be other gaps. I just haven't spent any time with it. Does anyone else know of gaps or things? I mean, we could add that certainly to the list. Was there something you were thinking of in particular, Raj, or?
No, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm waiting when your feature completes to try multi-cluster on my side and see what's happening, like what's missing. So I was thinking if somebody knew more than me, then that's it.
Okay.
I think the extension distribution is going to become more important.
I agree. I think that's all in the API bucket, but I guess
It's more about actual mechanics, making sure we can apply extensions dynamically.
Mhm.
Is there other stuff around the WASM ecosystem that we should prioritize, do you think? Is there
Well, I mean, there's going to be upstreaming work. I don't know if it's going to be done, but it's certainly, I don't think it's on our plate. It's more just we need to adjust ourselves to the world where it's based off proxy WASM rather than Istio biased, sort of. We need to make sure that the general WASM extensions are part of Istio, not just Istio extensions.
okay? I don't know quite how to capture that.
But I don't think it needs to be scheduled because it really depends on when proxy WASM becomes a thing. Because it's not yet a thing, right?
Right. How do we feel about monitoring the extensions themselves? Do we have a good understanding of how to do that, or do we need to start working on a design for that sort of thing? I don't recall all the metrics or anything that are exposed in Envoy.
It is not. It's a big problem actually, and that's part of making it production level is to make sure we have metering on all kinds of sandboxing working, but that's not really part of this working group.
Well, we sort of cross over with the data plane.
Right. I mean, there's no the basics is basically CPU cost of extension, and we don't have information on that.
Do you think Niraj and Jacob, do you think we need to do more with the tracing stuff? I mean, I think that falls in the APIs, but is there anything in particular?
I mean, the current mesh config stuff we did will work for us, but it will be good to have a first-class API.
Okay.
So multi-cluster tracing. Where are we going? Sorry, suppose somebody else saying something.
Yeah, that was me. Does that include kind of, the ability to separate gateways and sidecars? Like, would that be a part of the API for us to call out, like, whether it's tracing or, other things, other telemetry?
I think once we have an API, we can figure out how to select the right workload, I guess.
Okay.
But yeah, that should be a requirement.
It's interesting because we've had action items for a long time to figure out about first-class treatment of gateways. Do we still feel like there's a? I mean, I guess that work still needs to be done. Did we ever? I know, Kwat, you had looked at that. Did we ever feel like we got anywhere?
Not really, especially with egress gateway. Its status is still unclear, like what we should do.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Mandar has a proposal out for like canonicalizing black hole and pass-through telemetry, where we don't have to rely on control plane. That will be a great thing to add.
I think there's also a proposal to get better TCP level telemetry, just to understand whether Istio is in the loop or not.
Explain that again, Quad, to me.
So it turns out it's very hard to tell whether Istio is handling connections or not, because not always connections go through the same standard telemetry pipeline, and not always connections are correct. So like if you have an issue of protocol handling, then we don't actually emit events. So we need to improve there so that we can understand and record every connection made to proxy, not just the ones who are successful.
Interesting. I was going to ask I know we are calling this group extensions, but we are not creating extensions than the stats extensions. Are there other extensions that we need to have a roadmap for, i.e. whatever features Mixer provided, do we need extensions now for them? Like rate limiting. I don't know if there were others. I'm probably sure there were. Is that this group's charter?
Yeah, so the charter is unclear with the transition away from policies and telemetry. So maybe one of the ideas should just be clarifying the charter. I think we had wanted to provide documentation and a transition plan for all of the former functionality. So not just closing the feature gap for telemetry v2, but for v2 in general. So in my mind, that did involve doing the transfer work of every existing mixer adapter in some way, like coordinating that or actually taking that on. I don't know what others feel about that, but that was sort of my understanding of what mixer deprecation was about. So we provided some plan or some way to do the conversion. Rate limiting already exists in Envoy, right? So this would just be about so for that, it would be about documenting how to do that. And same with whitelisting.
Yes.
I'm trying to think through.
So the main thing, I'm looking at the documentation now, Mandar, sorry, Doug, for Mixer. So the templates were more around log entries, metric, tracing, quota, uh, and bunch of like whitelisting and other stuff. I think all of that is already there. We just need to document. The main issue is going to be around the adapters.
Right.
I don't know what's the strategy there. I feel like that should be a very high priority. If we want to deprecate, again, I also don't know how many people use these adapters, to be honest. So we need to make an informed choice here rather than doing some extra work which no one will use.
Yeah, I mean, a while back we told everyone to switch to gRPC-based adapters. And so it seems like one of the easiest, although maybe that's not easy, but one of the paths towards covering the gap would just be to have an official gRPC-based extension. I don't know what the right priority for that is, but I think that would go a decent way towards helping cover some of that.
Hang on. Do you still want out of this proxy adapters, or do you want all the adapters to be ported into proxy via extensions?
Well, I think eventually we want to provide the ability for them to run in the proxy, right? But I was just thinking, if you were transitioning across and you only had a out of proxy and out of mixer, out of process adapter running, wouldn't it be nice that you could just push config and we would send you the same data while you worked on getting WASM pipeline set up and testing and all of that? That's why I said I don't know the priority, but I feel like that's something that could be done and might help customers transition across the dividing line.
That's an interesting idea. I feel like we will be adding fair amount of code. I don't know how much of a code it is. For doing
Yeah, I don't know
this,
either.
when eventually we want to move to in proxy.
Well, I think we want to make sure it's easy to make extensions that call out, because many of them have to do anyways. It's not an option.
So if we want a generic extension that can be used for calling out any third-party things.
Especially for policy, we don't really have examples of extensions that call out, and then we only have telemetry extensions that call out. So things like rate limiting, we don't have experience implementing yet. So we do need to gain some experience and make sure it works. I don't know if we're gonna make it that so we can port existing stuff, but at least we need to make sure that the foundation is there first.
Why should user so for most of the other things that need third-party callouts like auth and stuff, Envoy already provides primitives for that. There are Envoy filters.
You don't have to use you don't have to use WASM for that, I agree. I mean, it's just a matter of choice.
I'm trying to get to the point that maybe in WASM, you might not be able to do what you want also.
So some things are more complicated. For example, we have a group working on the DLP, data leak prevention. So they want to be able to observe and then modify data. So that requires callouts during processing and then also modifying at the same time. So that's a case for an extension that is not existing in Envoy.
And you think that can be done in WASM? I guess so.
They can definitely call out because they have examples, but I'm not sure if that's why I'm saying that we need cases for extensions like this that may potentially need to call out and also modify requests at the same time.
All right. No, thanks. So this is making sense, more sense to me now. So basically, a generic framework, which is what Doug was saying also. Okay, that's a good. We should at least try it. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, we should pick a few. I don't think we can. We don't have examples, right? That's the problem. We don't. There are probably issues of it which we don't know about.
True.
One of the things I was thinking was that this promised intern army. This is the kind of thing that maybe someone could look at as, just like you say, try stuff out, see where we get.
That's an interesting idea. And even porting some of the mixer adapters, to be honest, to Wasm.
Yeah, like the Fluent D one that gets a lot of questions, things like that would be high on my list, I think. Okay, we're basically out of time. So the document is linked. Please contribute ideas there and help shape them into something, I don't know, more useful than this list. That would be much appreciated. And if there are any questions or agenda items for next week, please don't hesitate to add them, or 2 weeks from now, I guess. And then the last thing I wanted to say is I think there's some internal testing days coming up. So please take a look at the telemetry and the policy items under there and see if you can help out with testing. Other than that, thanks everyone.
Can I ask one quick question before you all disappear?
Sure.
This should be really quick. If I'm a 1.4 user, so I'm running Mixer, I update to 1.5, I'm going to get switched to telemetry v2 by default, right? Because that's the default in 1.5. What happens to do those other pods go away? Like, do the old services just disappear in an upgrade scenario? I haven't really tried it. Like, do those things? Does Istio D like take the place of the other things? Does that make any sense?
I have not verified this. I was under the impression that the upgrade scripts had been modified to look for Mixer. Any customization of the Mixer CRs, and then would maintain if there had been any customization, and if there hadn't, would go ahead and convert everything over to V2.
Okay.
But I have not tried it, and I don't know if that is actually what ended up happening. Kawat, do you have any recollection of?
No, sorry, I don't think I have a good answer.
Okay. Yeah, man, I was also going to then ask the second one, which is if I installed 1.5 natively, and then for whatever reason decided to configure it for Mixer, what effect that had on the services that were running for Istio. But maybe experimenting is the best way to find out.
Yeah, I think the further and further we get away from Mixer, the details are going to get vaguer and vaguer on what happens if you're still trying to use it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would hope that the tests are still running for it, but that's as much as I would know.
Right. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. All right. Bye.